Imagine walking into a bank, asking for a simple loan, only to be humiliated, accused of fraud, and physically assaulted by the staff. Now, imagine the shock on their faces when they realize the person they just disrespected owns the entire bank. What happens next? You won't believe it. Stay tuned. The Midtown branch of Sterling Trust hummed with the quiet efficiency of a high-end financial institution. The polished marble floors reflected the glow of recessed ceiling lights, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered near the reception area. Clients in designer suits sat in plush leather chairs, discussing investments in hushed tones, while tellers worked behind sleek counters, their movements precise and practiced. Ava Mitchell stepped inside, adjusting the simple black-framed glasses perched on her nose. Her usual commanding presence was deliberately subdued, no tailored suit, no entourage, no hint of the wealth and power she wielded as the CEO of Sterling Trust. Instead, she wore a plain navy blouse, comfortable jeans, and a modest handbag slung over her shoulder. The disguise was intentional. For weeks, reports had reached her desk about racial bias at her bank's branches. Complaints from minority customers about unfair treatment, delayed approvals, and outright dismissals had surfaced repeatedly. Ava had demanded answers from her executives, but the responses had been predictable: statistical reassurances, vague explanations, and an insistence that no such bias existed. She knew better. Numbers could be massaged, policies could be justified, but the truth? The truth had to be seen firsthand. She scanned the room, observing the patterns. A black man in his 50s stood near the reception desk, shifting uncomfortably as he waited. No one acknowledged him. A well-dressed white woman, however, had barely stepped through the doors before a banker rushed to greet her, escorting her into a private office. Ava exhaled slowly. The difference was stark. She joined the line for customer service, standing behind an older Latina woman who clutched a folder of documents to her chest. The woman whispered a quiet prayer under her breath, her fingers tightening around the folder's edge as if she expected rejection. Ava watched as a young teller finally called her forward, speaking with clipped efficiency, not unkind but certainly indifferent. When Ava reached the front of the line, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a stiff suit barely glanced at her before gesturing toward an open station. Mark Reynolds. She knew the name from corporate directories. Officially, he was the Midtown branch's director of customer relations. Unofficially, he was known for his ability to weed out unqualified applicants, at least. That was how the internal reports framed it. Ava had read enough complaints to recognize the pattern: arbitrary denials, excessive scrutiny, and a tendency to lose applications from certain customers. She approached the counter with an air of quiet confidence, setting her bag down before offering a polite smile. "I'd like to apply for a personal loan," she said. Mark looked at her, really looked this time, his eyes flickering over her simple attire, her lack of jewelry, the natural curls framing her face. A fractional pause. Then, his expression settled into something practiced. "What's the amount?" $500,000, Ava replied smoothly. "For a real estate investment." Mark let out a short breath, almost a laugh. His lips curled slightly, just enough to suggest amusement. "That's quite a sum," he said. "You realize not everyone qualifies for that kind of loan." Ava tilted her head. "I'd still like to apply." Mark leaned back in his chair, making no move toward his computer. "Well, that depends," he said. "Do you have collateral? Business records? Income statements?" "I have documentation," Ava replied. He didn't ask to see it. Instead, Mark folded his hands over his stomach, his voice slipping into a tone Ava recognized all too well: patronizing, subtly condescending, wrapped in the veneer of professionalism. "Our lending process is highly selective," he continued. "We prioritize clients who meet our rigorous standards. I'd hate for you to waste your time on an application that won't be approved." Ava let the words settle. He had made up his mind the moment he saw her. She didn't react. "Not yet." "Then let's go through the process," she said evenly. Mark sighed as if humoring her. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "I don't think this is the right bank for your needs. There are other institutions that cater to." He hesitated, just long enough for the implication to be clear. Ava held his gaze. "Cater to what?" Mark's smile didn't reach his eyes. to alternative financial solutions. A polite way of saying she didn't belong here. She took a measured breath. So you're denying my application before I've even filled it out? Mark shrugged. I'm just trying to save you the trouble. Ava didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or press the issue. Instead, she nodded once, then slowly gathered her bag. As she turned, something caught her attention. A sharply dressed man in a tailored gray suit stepping up to the next counter. His Rolex gleamed under the overhead lights, and his polished leather shoes barely made a sound on the floor. Mr. Wallace, Mark greeted warmly, standing up to shake the man's hand. Mark, the man replied, returning the handshake with ease. I need a loan. $500,000 for a new project. Ava watched as Mark's entire demeanor shifted. There was no hesitation, no warnings about rigorous standards, no mention of collateral or wasted time. Of course, Mark said, already turning to his computer. Let's get started. Ava tightened her grip on her bag. She had seen enough. Without a word, she walked toward the exit. Her heartbeat steady, her expression unreadable. She wasn't leaving in defeat. She was leaving with proof. Ava stood on the sidewalk just outside the Sterling Trust branch, watching through the glass windows as business continued as usual. Inside, tellers assisted customers. Bank managers held quiet conversations. And Mark Reynolds moved about with the same air of self-importance she had seen earlier. Nothing about the scene suggested that anything had been amiss. No one appeared rattled. No one seemed concerned that a potential client had just walked out with clear signs of discrimination hanging in the air. She adjusted her glasses and exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. Turning on her heel, Ava walked back into the bank with deliberate confidence. She no longer needed to observe from a distance. She had seen enough. Now, she was going to force a response. She stepped up to the same reception desk where Mark had dismissed her earlier. This time, instead of waiting for him to acknowledge her, she placed a folder on the counter and opened it with precision. I'd like to apply for that loan, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Mark turned, and for a brief second, his expression flickered with something close to irritation before he smoothed it over with a tight-lipped smile. We've already discussed this, he said. Ava slid a document toward him. Here are my financials. As you can see, I meet all the requirements. Mark hesitated before picking up the papers, his eyes skimming the numbers. The documents were flawless: bank statements, tax returns, and a solid credit score. Every detail was meticulously prepared, ensuring there was no legitimate reason for rejection. Still, Mark's lips pressed together. He didn't even pretend to run the numbers through the system. Instead, he placed the papers down as if they were worthless. These figures, he shook his head. Are you absolutely sure they're accurate? Ava's expression remained neutral. I wouldn't submit them if they weren't. Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. We have to be cautious. There are a lot of suspicious applications these days. Fraud is a real problem. Ava held his gaze. And you think I'm committing fraud? Mark didn't answer right away. His fingers drummed against the desk, his irritation no longer hidden. I think this process isn't a good fit for you, he said at last. Ava tilted her head slightly. Because? Mark's jaw tightened. Because I said so. The room had grown noticeably quieter. A few employees nearby had slowed their work, their eyes darting between the two. A security guard near the entrance shifted his stance. Ava didn't move. I'd like a written reason for my denial, she said. Mark exhaled sharply, his patience visibly thinning. That won't be necessary. It will be. Mark's voice rose. I don't have to explain myself to you. Ava remained steady. Actually, by law, you do. For the first time, a shadow of uncertainty crossed Mark's face. Listen, lady, he snapped, lowering his voice but not enough to mask his frustration. You're causing a scene. Ava didn't blink. I'm asking for the same service you just provided for the gentleman before me. Why is that a problem? Mark's hands clenched at his sides. His face was turning red now. The control he had wielded so effortlessly before slipping away. You need to leave, he said, his voice clipped. Ava didn't move. Mark signaled to the security guard, his voice loud enough for the entire bank to hear. Escort her out. Ava remained calm as the guard approached. Before he could reach her, she spoke again, her voice even but firm. You're refusing service to a qualified applicant without cause. And now you're using force to remove me. Is that correct? Mark's frustration boiled over. Without thinking, without hesitation, he lashed out. The sharp crack of a slap echoed through the bank. For a moment, everything stopped. Ava's head turned slightly from the impact, her cheek stinging. The room was deathly silent. Several employees had frozen mid-task, their eyes wide. A customer near the waiting area gasped audibly. Mark's own hand trembled where it had made contact. His breathing was heavy, his face still flushed with anger. Ava slowly lifted a hand to her face, touching the spot where he had struck her. Then, just as slowly, she lowered her hand, smoothing out the fabric of her blouse as if nothing had happened. Mark took a step back, realizing what he had done. She was disturbing the peace. He barked, as if justifying himself. His voice wavered ever so slightly. "Arrest her," he ordered the security guard. Now, Ava didn't resist as the guard stepped forward. She simply looked up, her eyes cold and assessing, as if she were memorizing every detail of the moment. Because she was. Tucked discreetly inside the lining of her handbag, a small camera had captured everything. As the security guard grabbed her arm, leading her toward the exit, Ava allowed herself the faintest of smiles. She had exactly what she needed. Ava stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool afternoon breeze brushing against her face. Behind her, the heavy glass doors of Sterling Trust swung shut with a dull finality. Inside, the bank hummed with its usual routine as if nothing had happened. As if a customer hadn't just been publicly humiliated and thrown out. A few people lingered nearby, their gazes flitting between Ava and the entrance. A young woman holding her phone at an angle, her eyes darting between the screen and Ava, had likely recorded the entire incident. A couple of others whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Mark Reynolds stood just inside, his arms crossed, his face set in a self-satisfied smirk. Through the glass, Ava could see him turn to one of the tellers and speak sharply. Though she couldn't hear the words, the meaning was clear enough from the way the young woman stiffened. "If any of you so much as acknowledge her again, consider yourselves unemployed." Ava didn't react, she didn't argue, she didn't look back. Instead, she exhaled slowly, adjusted the strap of her handbag, and walked away, blending into the steady flow of pedestrians along the busy Midtown street. To any observer, she might have looked like just another frustrated customer, defeated and humiliated, but inside, she was calm, calculated. Everything had gone exactly as she'd expected. A few blocks down, she stepped into a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. It was the kind of place that felt out of sync with the rest of the city. Low lighting, wooden tables, a chalkboard menu listing specialty drinks in careful handwriting. The barista barely glanced up as she entered, giving her the privacy she needed. Ava settled into a corner booth, pulled out her phone, and unlocked the screen. A single notification blinked, a new text from an unknown number. "I saw what happened. You need to talk to me before it's too late." She narrowed her eyes. The area code was familiar, internal to Sterling Trust. Whoever sent this wasn't just a random witness. They were someone inside. She stared at the message for a moment, weighing her options. Then she tapped the number and called. The line rang twice before a voice answered, deep and measured. "Don't say my name." Ava remained silent, waiting. "If you really want to expose the truth, you need to move fast." The voice continued, "There's more going on than you realize." Ava leaned back against the worn leather seat, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone. "Then start talking," she said. A brief pause. Then the voice spoke again. Lower now, as if checking for unwanted ears. "They're manipulating the loan system. It's not just about denying people like you. They're approving massive loans for high-risk clients, white clients, with the right connections. People who shouldn't qualify but do because they have someone inside pulling the strings." Ava's mind clicked into place, the puzzle pieces shifting. She had suspected discrimination, but this was more than that. This was systemic, deliberate, and profitable for someone. "Mark's not acting alone," the caller continued. "He's just following orders." Ava glanced toward the cafe's front window. Outside, cars rolled past, a cyclist wove between traffic, and people moved along the sidewalk without a care. Who's giving the orders? She asked. Another pause. You already know where to look. The line went dead. Ava lowered the phone slowly, staring at the black screen. She didn't need to call back. The message was clear. Mark was just a cog in something much larger. She set her phone on the table, exhaled through her nose, and flexed her fingers, shaking out the tension that had settled in her shoulders. Then, methodically, she selected the video file from earlier, the one capturing every second of Mark's outburst. His slap, his order to remove her. She forwarded it to a secure, off-site email account, a failsafe. Because if this was bigger than just Mark, she needed to be ready for what came next. Ava sat in her car outside Sterling Trust's corporate office, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel. The building loomed before her, sleek, modern, its glass facade reflecting the city skyline. To any outsider, it was a symbol of financial success, a fortress of wealth and power. But Ava knew better. She had built this empire, and she had seen firsthand how easily a structure that looked impenetrable could rot from the inside. She scrolled through her phone, rereading the text from the unknown number. The words played over in her mind like a warning she couldn't shake. Mark wasn't acting alone. There was an entire system behind him, one that had allowed corruption to fester beneath the surface. And if that system had enablers, Lauren Carter was one of them. Lauren had always been careful. As an internal legal advisor for Sterling Trust, she specialized in reviewing lending policies, ensuring compliance, and, when necessary, burying things that shouldn't see the light of day. Ava had met her a handful of times at corporate functions, always impeccably dressed, her words measured and deliberate. She was someone who understood the game and played it well. Ava stepped out of the car and made her way inside. The receptionist barely glanced up before gesturing her toward the elevator, unaware of the storm she was about to bring. Lauren's office was on the 24th floor. The door was slightly ajar when Ava reached it, and she could hear the faint tapping of a keyboard inside. She knocked once, stepping in without waiting for an invitation. Lauren looked up from her desk, startled. For a brief moment, something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe even guilt, but it was gone just as quickly. She straightened in her chair, her expression smoothing into polite professionalism. Ava, she said, her tone carefully neutral. I wasn't expecting you. Ava closed the door behind her. I figured it was better this way. Lauren gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Have a seat. Ava didn't. Instead, she placed both hands on the back of the chair, leaning slightly forward. I need to talk to you about Midtown. Lauren's fingers tensed around the pen she had been holding. What about it? I think you already know. Ava let the words hang between them. Mark Reynolds, loan denials, selective approvals. The fact that this isn't just one rogue employee making bad decisions, it's systemic. Lauren inhaled slowly, setting the pen down with deliberate care. Ava, you know I can't discuss internal matters. I have a video. Ava cut in. Mark attacking me, ordering security to remove me after denying my loan application without reason. The kind of thing that would make the headlines if it were to find its way outside of this building. Lauren's face drained of color. It was the first real reaction Ava had seen from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the city below filtered in through the office window, the only sound in the heavy silence. Lauren finally exhaled, shaking her head. You don't understand what you're stepping into. Then explain it to me, Ava said. Lauren hesitated, then pushed her chair back and stood. She walked over to the window, crossing her arms as she stared out. Mark's just doing what he's told, she admitted. This isn't about him. He's a blunt instrument, nothing more. If you think getting rid of him is going to fix this, you're wrong. Ava watched her carefully. Then tell me who's really behind it. Lauren hesitated again, then turned to face her. You need to let this go, she said, her voice quieter now. This is bigger than you think. Ava studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, she said, turning toward the door. If that's your answer. She walked out without another word, keeping her pace steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't look back, but she wasn't leaving empty-handed. She had barely stepped into the hallway when she heard it, the faint sound of Lauren's voice through the office door. Urgent and hushed. Ava stopped just out of sight, tilting her head slightly to listen. She knows. Lauren whispered, "I can't keep this quiet much longer. If this gets out, everything we've built collapses." Ava's grip tightened around her phone. Lauren was scared. That meant there was something worth fearing. By the time she reached the elevator, Ava had already made up her mind. That night, she sat in her apartment, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the windows. She pulled up her email, attached the video of Mark, and typed out a message to Lauren. "I know what you're hiding. You have 24 hours. Either you help me, or you go down with them." She hit send. Then she leaned back in her chair, watching the screen, waiting. Lauren sat at her desk, staring at the email on her screen. The cursor blinked at the end of Ava's message, the words burning into her mind. Her pulse quickened as she reread it, her fingers tightening around the edge of her keyboard. She leaned back in her chair, forcing herself to breathe. There was no way Ava had sent this lightly. The woman didn't make idle threats. If she had proof, and if that proof went public, it wouldn't just take down Mark. It would tear into the entire foundation of sterling trust. She moved quickly, opening a secure folder on her desktop. Encrypted files, case notes, internal communications, all the documents she had kept track of over the years. Nothing blatantly illegal, but enough gray areas to make even the most seasoned corporate lawyers nervous. She checked the email source, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was it traceable? Had Ava sent it from a secure account? Lauren's stomach tightened. She knew how careful Ava was. There was a good chance the message had already been distributed elsewhere as a fail-safe. A soft vibration from her phone made her flinch. She snatched it off the desk, half expecting another message. But it wasn't Ava. It was instinct that told her what she needed to do next. Grabbing her bag, she hurried out of her office, ignoring the curious glances from colleagues as she made her way to the parking garage. The entire building suddenly felt suffocating. Every hallway too narrow, every passing face a potential problem. She needed to talk to David. Her hands clenched around the steering wheel as she drove through the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the skyline. But she barely noticed. David Langston's home was in an exclusive gated community, a sprawling property tucked behind tall hedges and guarded security posts. Lauren pressed the call button at the entrance, identifying herself, and the gate slowly swung open. Inside, the house was just as she remembered, impeccably maintained. Expensive without being ostentatious. David had always been careful about appearances. The type of man who knew exactly how much wealth to display and how much to keep hidden. A butler opened the door, leading her into the study where David was waiting. He was already pouring himself a drink, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened as if he had been expecting her. "I assume this isn't a social visit," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Lauren closed the door behind her. "Ava Mitchell has proof." David took a slow sip, his expression unreadable. "Proof of what, exactly?" Lauren stepped forward. "Mark's actions at the Midtown branch. She has a video of him physically assaulting her. If that gets out, it won't just be about one bad manager. It'll lead to questions, investigations." David set his glass down on the polished mahogany table. "And what exactly do you expect me to do about it?" Lauren hesitated. "We need to get ahead of this. Shut it down before she makes a move." David let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You're thinking too small, Lauren. Mark was never going to be a permanent fixture. He was useful, but disposable. If this gets messy, we let him take the fall." Lauren stiffened. "You'd throw him under the bus that easily?" David's expression turned sharp. "That's the difference between running a company and being a cog in it. The system survives because we know when to cut our losses." She stared at him, suddenly feeling the weight of every decision she had ever made for this company. David picked up his drink again, watching her over the rim of the glass. "You have two choices. Help me control Ava, or let Mark take all the blame. But be very clear on one thing. If Ava wins this, you won't have a place here anymore." Lauren didn't answer. Not yet. When she left the house, the evening air felt colder. As she reached her car, a prickling sensation ran down her spine. Someone was watching. She turned, scanning the quiet street. Nothing seemed out of place. No lingering figures. No obvious cars parked in unusual spots. But she knew better than to ignore her instincts. Sliding into the driver's seat, She locked the doors and pulled out her phone. A single message waited for her. I know who you just met. I hope you make the right decision. 12 hours. Ava. Lauren gripped the phone tighter. Her breath unsteady. She was running out of time. Ava sat in her apartment. The glow of the city stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The night was calm, but inside her mind, everything was in motion. She had given Lauren a deadline, but waiting for her to act was a gamble. And Ava wasn't the type to sit back and hope for the best. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she had memorized long ago. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. You better have something good for me. Mitchell, Xavier Cole said. Xavier had built his reputation uncovering corporate scandals. The kind that sent shockwaves through Wall Street. He had taken down hedge funds, exposed insider trading schemes, and rattled banking giants. But he didn't publish anything unless he had the full story. Ava sent him the video file. Open it, she said. There was a long silence as he watched. Then, a slow exhale. Damn, he muttered. This is clear as day. Physical assault, discrimination, blatant abuse of power. But what's your play here? You want me to run it? Not yet, Ava said. I need them to panic first. She laid out her plan. Xavier would reach out to Sterling Trust's corporate office under the guise of verifying a tip. He wouldn't reveal the full details, just enough to suggest that something big was coming. The goal wasn't to expose them immediately. It was to force them into making a mistake. If I go poking around, they'll retaliate, Xavier warned. That's what I'm counting on, Ava replied. By the next morning, the first tremors hit Sterling Trust. Lauren had barely stepped into her office when her assistant rushed in. Looking anxious. There's a situation, the young woman said, handing her a printed email. A reporter reached out this morning. He's asking about a potential discrimination case at the Midtown branch. Lauren felt her stomach drop. She didn't need to ask who the reporter was. Minutes later, her phone rang. Conference room. Now. David Langston's voice was calm, but Lauren could hear the underlying tension. The meeting was already in progress when she entered. A handful of executives sat around the table, their expressions grim. David stood at the head, flipping through a stack of printed articles. We have a problem, he announced. He slid one of the papers across the table. Lauren's breath caught. The headlines were brutal. Is Sterling Trust's CEO mentally unstable? Shocking allegations about Ava Mitchell's past. David tapped the table with 2 fingers, his expression unreadable. Ava Mitchell thinks she has the upper hand, he said, but we've been ahead of her from the start. Lauren felt the room shift. The smear campaign had already begun. If she releases that video now, David continued, it won't be seen as evidence. It'll be seen as a desperate move from a woman who's cracking under pressure. A few executives exchanged glances, nodding in approval. Lauren swallowed hard. Ava had set a trap, but David had seen it coming. Now, the game had changed. Later that evening, Lauren sat alone in her office, staring at the headlines on her screen. Ava had made her move, but Sterling Trust had struck first. A notification lit up her phone. I know what they're doing. Ava's message read, but they're forgetting one thing. I still have you. Lauren closed her eyes. She had spent years navigating the shadows of corporate power, but now she stood at a crossroads. She had 12 hours to decide which side she was on. Lauren sat in her car, parked outside the Grand Ashton Hotel. The sleek, glass-walled building towered over the city skyline, its golden lights reflecting against the darkened streets. Inside, the most powerful figures of Sterling Trust were gathering for a private meeting, one that she had been summoned to with little explanation. She gripped the steering wheel, staring at her own reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was composed, but her mind raced. Ava had proof, David had power, and she was standing in the middle of a war that would not end without casualties. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, adjusted the lapels of her blazer, and made her way inside. A concierge escorted her to a conference suite on the top floor. The room was dimly lit, with a long mahogany table stretching across the center. Several high-ranking executives were already seated, murmuring in low voices. The air was thick with tension. David Langston stood near the head of the table, sipping from a crystal tumbler. His expression was unreadable as he nodded in her direction. "Lauren," he said smoothly, "glad you could make it." She took a seat, scanning the room. These were not just board members, these were the decision makers. The people who pulled the strings behind the scenes. David set his glass down and leaned forward. "We have a problem," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "And as always, we're going to handle it before it handles us." One of the executives cleared his throat. "How much damage are we looking at?" David gestured toward a folder in front of him. "Ava Mitchell has a video that, in the wrong hands, could create a narrative we do not want." He paused. "Fortunately, we have options." Lauren felt a cold chill run down her spine. David slid the folder open, revealing a neatly typed document. "The simplest solution," he continued, "is to ensure Ava never sees a reason to release it." The words were casual, but their meaning was clear. "Buy her silence," Lauren said, her voice steady. David nodded. "A generous settlement, enough to make her walk away from this fight." Another executive spoke up. "And if she refuses?" David exhaled, tapping the edge of his glass. "Then we make sure she doesn't have the credibility to fight back." He turned a page in the folder. "We've already started taking the necessary steps." He continued. "Selective leaks to the media. Calls to the right journalists. By the time we're done, no one will take her seriously." Lauren glanced down at the pages, her stomach twisting. The headlines had already started surfacing. But this was a coordinated attack. She flipped to the next page and froze. It was a dossier on Ava, not just her business dealings, but personal records, family history, old legal disputes, even minor, irrelevant incidents from years ago, things that could be twisted, weaponized. They weren't just planning to discredit her. They were going to destroy her. Lauren looked up. "This is necessary," David interrupted. Lauren felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on her. This was the moment. There was no neutral ground left to stand on. David pushed a thick envelope across the table. "Your role in this is simple," he said. "Make sure she listens. Make sure she understands what's at stake." Lauren hesitated before picking it up. It was heavier than she expected. When she left the room, the envelope still in her hand, she didn't go straight to her car. She needed air, clarity. Under a streetlight outside the hotel, she carefully pulled open the flap. There was no check inside, just a stack of documents. The plan to bury Ava Mitchell, every detail mapped out, down to the last smear campaign. Lauren let out a slow breath. This wasn't a bribe, it was a warning. Lauren gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The streetlights cast long shadows across the dashboard as she sat in silence. The envelope from David resting on the passenger seat. Inside was everything: plans, directives, and the blueprint of Sterling Trust's corruption. She could still hear David's voice in her head. He had been so calm, so certain. Either she helped silence Ava, or she accepted that she would go down with Mark. She had spent years justifying the compromises she made, convincing herself that she was protecting the company, her career, and everything she had built. But this wasn't just another legal gray area. This was a machine, designed to exploit, manipulate, and discard people without hesitation. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had never expected to call. Ava answered on the first ring. "I have something for you," Lauren said, "but I can't talk over the phone. Meet me at the Grant Hotel parking garage, 10th floor, in 1 hour." Ava didn't ask questions. She simply said, "I'll be there." Lauren ended the call and exhaled. The moment she stepped out of her car tonight, there would be no turning back. The Grant Hotel's underground parking garage was mostly empty at this hour, the dim yellow lighting casting a cold glow over the concrete structure. Ava arrived exactly on time, stepping out of a dark sedan, her posture controlled, her gaze sweeping the lot for any signs of a trap. Lauren stood beside her own car, the folder pressed tightly to her chest. For a brief moment, neither woman moved. Ava was the first to break the silence. "You said you had something for me." Lauren hesitated, her grip tightening. She had spent the entire drive here debating whether she should do this, whether she should hand over something that could tear down an entire empire. Finally, she extended the envelope. Ava took it without breaking eye contact, flipping it open and scanning the first few pages. Her expression remained unreadable, but Lauren noticed the way her fingers stiffened slightly as she turned the pages. This isn't just about me, Ava murmured. Lauren swallowed hard. No, it's not. The folder contained more than just the plan to smear Ava's name. It outlined the entire strategy behind Sterling Trust's predatory lending practices, how they selectively approved high-risk loans for certain clients while systematically rejecting others. It was a rigged system, one designed to funnel wealth toward the privileged few while leaving others trapped in financial ruin. Mark Reynolds had been just one of many willing enforcers. Ava closed the folder and looked up at Lauren. You were part of this. It wasn't a question. Lauren let out a slow breath. I told myself I wasn't. She admitted that I was just following orders. That I didn't have the full picture. But I did. I always did. Ava studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, holding the folder up slightly. You understand what happens next? Lauren hesitated. I can't go back after this, she whispered. Ava nodded. No, you can't. Silence stretched between them. Then Ava's voice softened, just slightly. But you can decide what side you're on now. Lauren looked away, her pulse pounding. She wasn't ready to answer that. Ava stepped out of the underground parking lot, the weight of the folder pressing against her side. The night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the occasional blare of a car horn. She moved with purpose, keeping her posture relaxed, but her mind raced. Sterling Trust was too powerful to confront head-on. If she made a wrong move, they would bury her before she even had a chance to fight. Behind her, Lauren lingered by her car, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She hadn't spoken much after handing over the documents, but Ava had seen the hesitation in her eyes. They'll never fully trust you, Ava said without turning around. You could be next. Lauren's silence stretched, but Ava didn't wait for a response. She walked toward her car, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled onto the street. Every decision from this point on had to be calculated. There was no room for mistakes. An hour later, Ava sat in the back booth of a quiet diner, stirring a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from her, Xavier Cole leaned back against the vinyl seat, flipping through the pages of the folder she had brought. The journalist's sharp eyes moved quickly over the documents, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges. This is deep, he muttered, much deeper than just one corrupt branch. Ava nodded. That's why I need you to verify everything before we release it. If we go public with this and there's even a single inconsistency, they'll use it against us. Xavier exhaled through his nose, setting the papers down. This is airtight, he admitted, but it's also dangerous. If they catch wind of what we're doing, they already have. Ava interrupted. Her phone buzzed on the table. A news notification. The headline made her stomach tighten. Ava Mitchell linked to financial fraud scandal. Xavier grabbed his own phone, scrolling through the article, his jaw clenched. That was fast. Ava skimmed through the accusations. Sterling Trust had moved preemptively, planting fabricated evidence that tied her to fraudulent loan approvals. The details were convincing. Manufactured bank statements, doctored signatures, manipulated audit trails. Her name wasn't just being dragged through the mud. They were laying the groundwork to destroy her credibility before she could expose them. This was planned, she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Xavier frowned. If they're willing to fabricate this much, they'll go even further if you push them. Ava met his gaze. Then we don't wait. She pulled out a second flash drive from her bag and slid it across the table. I need this out in the morning, she said. Not everything, just enough to make them scramble. Xavier hesitated. Once this starts, there's no going back. Ava's grip on her coffee cup tightened. There was never going to be a way back. The night before the meeting, Ava sat in her apartment, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass windows. Lights flickered from the buildings. A quiet reminder of the world outside, one that was about to change. Her fingers hovered over her phone, composing the message that would send ripples through the core of Sterling Trust. Tomorrow, you will see the true face of this institution. She sent it anonymously to every major shareholder. There was no going back now. The response was immediate. Within an hour, whispers of concern had spread through the upper ranks. A crisis meeting was called. By morning, the entire board would be on high alert, scrambling to control something they couldn't yet understand. Sterling Trust was on the defensive. At exactly 9 a.m., Ava walked into the boardroom, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. The room was packed, executives, investors, senior managers, all seated in tense silence. David Langston stood at the head of the table, his presence dominating the room. Beside him were other high-ranking officials, each of them carefully chosen to present a unified front. David's voice was calm, controlled. We're here today to address a situation that has caused unnecessary disruption to this company. Ava took her seat, watching as he continued. There have been accusations, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. Accusations that seek to undermine the integrity of this institution, made by someone who, until recently, held a leadership position here. Ava felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward her. David exhaled, as if burdened by responsibility. Unfortunately, we must acknowledge that Ava Mitchell's recent behavior has raised serious concerns about her ability to continue serving this company. A murmur rippled through the board. Some members nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. David pressed forward. We have evidence that she has been spreading false allegations, attempting to destabilize the firm, and engaging in reckless behavior that. The screen behind him flickered to life. Ava didn't move. She didn't need to. The room fell into stunned silence as the video played. Mark Reynolds, standing at the teller counter, his voice sharp with disdain. Ava, calm but firm, asking for fair treatment. Then, the slap. The room collectively inhaled. David froze, his words cut off. But the video wasn't done. It cut to something new, internal documents flashing across the screen. Loan approval records, manipulated financial statements, the clear, undeniable evidence of Sterling Trust's predatory practices. Then, a final frame. David Langston's signature at the bottom of a directive. Silence. David turned, eyes blazing. Who did this? Lauren Carter stood near the control panel, her hand resting on the laptop. You did this to yourself, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Ava leaned back in her chair, meeting David's furious gaze. Now, she said, who's really unfit to lead? The boardroom was in chaos. Murmurs escalated into frantic whispers as executives scrambled to grasp the gravity of what had just unfolded. Some reached for their phones, desperate to contain the crisis, while others sat frozen, their faces pale under the fluorescent lighting. David Langston stood motionless at the head of the table. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white against the polished wood as if sheer force alone could hold the crumbling empire together. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward Ava. You think a video is enough to bring me down? His voice was measured, but the rage simmered beneath the surface. This is nothing but a coordinated attack. Fabricated evidence. A desperate attempt to tarnish this institution. Ava didn't flinch. She had anticipated this response. She reached into her bag and pulled out another file, the one Lauren had given her. With deliberate movements, she laid it out on the table for everyone to see. This isn't just about a video, she said, her tone unwavering. This is about a system built on exploitation. Sterling Trust has been approving high-risk loans for insiders while systematically denying fair lending to others. And these documents prove it. The room fell silent again. But this time, it was different. David's eyes flickered toward the papers. And for the first time, there was a crack in his composure. He knew what was in there. Ava flipped through the pages, her voice steady as she laid out the details. The manipulated approval processes, the forged financial risk assessments, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable communities. Every signature, every directive, every carefully orchestrated maneuver designed to benefit the elite while crushing those who couldn't fight back. She paused before lifting her gaze to the board members. Some of you already knew, she said. Others turned a blind eye. But now, you're all on record. A weighted silence stretched across the room. Then, the turning point. One of the senior board members, a man who had been in quiet discussion with others, cleared his throat. He pushed his chair back and stood. We need an immediate internal review, he announced. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Effective immediately. David Langston is suspended pending investigation. David's head snapped toward him. You can't be serious. But he wasn't the only one. Another executive nodded. This is beyond damage control. If we don't act now, we'll all go down with you. David's face darkened. His control was slipping, and he knew it. Ava watched as the board moved swiftly, turning on their once untouchable leader. It was no longer just about ethics, it was about survival. Mark Reynolds, the man who had struck her at the bank, was the next to fall. A swift decision was made to terminate his employment, followed by the announcement that legal action would be taken against him for misconduct. Lauren remained seated, watching it all unfold. Her expression was unreadable, but Ava knew what she was thinking. She had helped expose the truth, but in doing so, she had also severed any chance of returning to the world she once belonged to. As the meeting dissolved into a frenzy of phone calls and urgent discussions, Ava stood. She had won this battle, but the war against institutions like Sterling Trust was far from over. She turned, walking toward the door. The fight would continue, but for now, she had done what she came here to do. Ava sat in her office, staring at the city skyline beyond the glass. The sun hung low, casting a warm glow over the buildings, but the weight in her chest remained. She had won. David Langston was finished. Sterling Trust was imploding, and the truth had finally come to light. And yet, victory didn't feel the way she had imagined. The fallout had been swift and brutal. News stations ran back-to-back coverage of the scandal, dissecting every detail with the same relentless hunger that had once targeted her. Sterling Trust's stock had plummeted overnight, wiping billions from the market. Board members scrambled to distance themselves, offering carefully worded statements about their shock and deep concern. Then came the real consequence. A federal investigation had been launched, not just into Sterling Trust but into the broader financial web it was entangled with. Government agencies were digging into old records, tracing the money, peeling back layers of corruption that had thrived in the shadows for years. And just like that, the empire she had once helped build was unraveling. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, all she felt was exhaustion. Lauren had disappeared. No one had seen her after the meeting. No phone calls, no emails, nothing. Ava had checked every contact she could think of, but it was as if Lauren had vanished into thin air. She didn't know if she had fled, if she had gone into hiding, or if someone had made sure she wouldn't talk again. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. That's when she saw it. A small envelope, plain and unmarked, resting on the center of her desk. She hadn't heard anyone come in. Her heartbeat quickened as she reached for it, her fingers hesitating for just a moment before tearing it open. Inside was a single slip of paper. The message was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. They were just the tip of the iceberg. There's someone bigger behind all of this. Be careful. Ava's grip tightened around the note. She stood, walking to the window, staring down at the streets below. Cars moved, people walked. The city carried on as if nothing had changed. But she knew better. She had spent years believing she understood power, how it moved, how it hid, how it controlled. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she had only scratched the surface. She had torn down Sterling Trust. But what if the real threat was still out there, watching? Power isn't just about wealth or titles. It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching. This story is a stark reminder that arrogance and discrimination can lead to downfall, and that justice has a way of revealing itself in the most unexpected moments. What would you have done in Ava's place? Let us know in the comments. And if you love uncovering hidden truths, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more stories that challenge power, expose corruption, and deliver justice. Stay curious, stay aware,